where Lewis is always trying to get Donna to work for him.
I know.
And he's like, don't get me wrong, I'll throw her out the window in a heartbeat. As a result of Harvey's representation, Lewis loses a big Fortune 500 client. Let's talk about the admissibility of evidence.
We have the drama that is Harvey and Donna's relationship, and Harvey's pissed. Welcome to Suits on Suits. We're your hosts, Jared and Quinn Mayberry. In this show, we talk about legal concepts, plot points, and the culture of law from the show Suits. What are we going to talk about today, Quinn?
Yeah, today we're going to talk about how a firm selects and retains clients. Mm-hmm. We're going to talk about the admissibility of evidence, specifically as it relates to evidence that's illegally obtained.
Some con law topics.
Yeah, exactly. And then we're going to close out the episode with a conversation on Harvey and Donna's relationship.
I wonder whose side we're going to fall on. Donna. Before we dive in, let's get everyone up to speed on what happened in this episode. We're talking about episode 12 of season 1, titled Dogfight. Okay, in this episode, we're talking about the season finale of season 1, and it's a continuation of the storyline from episode 11. Harvey meets with Clifford Danner in an attempt to clear his conscience. Clifford Danner is the defendant was the defendant in a criminal case that Harvey prosecuted. After being persuaded by Mike, Clifford agrees to be represented by Harvey and Mike. Using the previously buried evidence, Harvey is able to win a retrial, but after negotiating with a new prosecutor, Clifford is risking the maximum sentence. In the end, Harvey and Mike are able to win Clifford's freedom with a little inspiration from Mississippi Burning. In this episode, we also get some insight into Lewis's place in the firm, but to be honest, I think these insights raise more questions than they answer.
Yeah, I completely agree. I guess one other point, whenever we get the Harvey prosecuted this case and it resulted in Clifford Danner spending like roughly a decade in prison, and he's got a few more years left on his sentence.
4, I think.
Yeah. So let's talk about Lewis's place at the firm, or Lewis's leverage here.
Yep.
So as a result of Harvey's representation of this convicted murderer, Lewis loses a big Fortune 500 client.
Yeah, I'm probably billing millions of dollars to this client.
Surely, yeah. These big companies will oftentimes retain a handful of law firms, but even your sliver of their business could be enough to build an entire book of business potentially.
You're
for a
talking
partner.
7, 8, could be 9 figures.
Yeah. And so to be fair, it's a huge consideration and something that any partner would want to talk about, I imagine.
Yeah.
And then we also have this wrinkle where Lewis is saying that he's taking a straw poll discreetly of the partners at the firm, and they don't think it's a good look for Harvey to be representing Clifford Danner.
Yeah, exactly. So basically, he doesn't think that the firm should be representing Clifford Danner because it's going to challenge his book of business, and he wanted more weight behind that statement. And so he's done a straw poll of the rest of the partners. Who knows how accurate it is? But it could be. I mean, if he's losing clients, other people maybe too, or they're afraid of it at least. So yeah, we're in a world now where Lewis is trying to prevent this case from going forward, but Harvey obviously has his conscience to deal with.
Yeah, and so honestly, we typically see this play out as Lewis, it feels very spiteful of Harvey. This felt like a real concern. It
was logically reasoned.
Yeah, it's at least reasonable. I'd be concerned if I just lost, what might be my biggest client over some other partner's decision. While I completely support Harvey taking this case, it's a reasonable concern.
Well, I guess maybe taking a step back. Yeah. So I think Harvey clearly he's struggling with the decision he made as prosecutor, whether or not, it sounds like he didn't know about the burying of evidence and is quite upset about it and thus wants to make it right. A couple of things here. If you're in Harvey's shoes, under the circumstances, knowing that your new firm, is going to be challenged by taking on this case, does it make the most sense for Harvey to be the one who takes on this case, or for him to find, a defense attorney that could take it on who would be equally competent?
Oh, great question. Yeah, I think I was viewing it from a different angle. I don't think he would take the case because of, ethical considerations.
Totally agree,
and the
suspending belief on that one. Yeah.
We've talked about this on the show before, but trust with your client is arguably, the most important part of that relationship, and resuscitating the trust in that situation is going to be tough. But setting those things aside, I think you bring up a really good point here where
other alternatives.
Yeah, there are alternatives where you could probably, go about trying to right this wrong in a more efficient way.
There is this understanding that the law is a practice. It's a calling, it's a practice, there are ethical duties around it, et cetera. But it's also, at these large law firms, very big business.
Yeah.
And so in this situation, these two things are in tension.
Yeah. I mean, before we dive into this tension though, let's just acknowledge nobody else could represent Clifford Danner like Harvey could represent Clifford Danner.
That's true.
So we've got a problem there from the onset, but.
All right, I take it back. So no one, maybe like 80% as well as Harvey.
Yeah.
In this circumstance, how would you fall, or how would you make a decision if you were in Harvey's shoes?
Oh man, that's a good question. So I think that's tough. I would feel beyond compelled to try and right this wrong.
Agreed.
I don't think I would feel the same requirement for, to be the lead attorney on the case. And in fact, based on the relationship and the fact that Harvey had previously prosecuted him, I'd probably be willing to see, even if I thought I was an incredibly capable trial attorney, I might not be the right lawyer for this case. And so you might be able to, kind of skirt that tension between the business interest and, doing what's right, making sure that Clifford Danner has representation by finding somebody else who's a great fit for this case. That kind of cute, neat little maneuver aside, if push came to shove and it was either I was representing this person or nobody was, you got to represent them. I mean, it's just such a huge injustice.
Yeah, agreed. I mean, you took the liberty of, frankly, the guy never gets back the 10 years or however long it was. I can't remember exactly.
I think it was like he'd already been in there for like 7 or 8 maybe, and he had roughly 4 years left on his sentence. I think.
So he never gets those years back, and frankly, he has to deal with the negative publicity of having been convicted, even if he gets freed, and that will implicate the rest of his life. Yeah, there's this socially, as well as economically.
Absolutely, and there's always going to be this shadow following him around of like, people have limited time and bandwidth. It's like, well, did he do it? I mean, he was convicted. Like, not everybody's going to dive into the facts of the case and understand that there was buried evidence. It's like, this is going to follow him around forever.
Well, and if anything, a summary of there's buried evidence is, it's a legal maneuver, right? Yeah. Like, it was a technical issue on the legal side, and they had to right that wrong, and now he's free. Like, you could see that narrative, almost like a game of telephone, that narrative spin out, and then again, he's kind of hung with the arbitrage that is, that he was guilty.
And so I guess reframing this a little bit, we're on the same page that, making sure that Clifford Danner has representation is the righteous thing to do here. And to the extent where I think you and I almost don't see an alternative, you've got to make sure that you have to help him get representation. Is that fair to say?
I think that's right. I think it is incumbent upon Harvey to negotiate with the new prosecutor. Mm-hmm. And I think it's incumbent upon him to understand that what happened in that office was wrong, how this conviction occurred was wrong, and using all his tact and political skill to persuade this guy in the background, the new prosecutor in the background, I think is Harvey's responsibility, whether or not he represents Clifford in the new case.
And so we would think maybe a little bit less of him or maybe a lot less of him if he didn't do all of those things. Setting that aside, do you think it's realistic that a Fortune 500 company would stop representing or would stop using a firm because of their representation of a criminal defendant like this?
I don't have any specifics, but I 100% could see that being the case.
Yeah, me too. But I thought that they did a great job on this episode, specifically coming up with the example where it was like somebody had this idiosyncratic personal reason. Yeah. A board member had a child at the school. They were plugged into the community at the school. Yeah. This person had been vilified, and the victim, had sympathy from presumably most of the community or everybody at that school. And there was like personal blowback. And I feel like them taking action it bringing it to their awareness and feeling compelled to do something about it felt kind of plausible to me. I don't know.
I guess the fact that makes it hard for me to believe in this case is that the board member has no knowledge of this, the fact that the prosecutor just went down for burying evidence and that this is a case that was being brought forward.
Completely agree.
Because without the omission of those two facts, this feels like a very rash decision by the board member. But maybe an example that's even more extreme that I was just thinking about. Let's say your firm is defending Alex Jones in his defamation claim against the Sandy Hook families.
Yeah.
And you're, as a board member, if the firm are representing Alex Jones, I would be looking for other representation than that firm.
Yeah.
I think I would move my case or my workload to another firm if they felt that they should represent Alex Jones.
You want to feel aligned with your firm's values, basically.
Yeah, because effectively, whether or not you I think there's this idea that gets perpetrated that my job is to advocate for any client. The reality is you're someone who's fighting for a position as a lawyer, and especially a litigator. I kind of question the lawyer who's purely a mercenary and who's willing to do it for anyone.
Yeah, I mean, I completely understand where you're coming from. And I think that there's, just to add another wrinkle to the conversation, there's this, in my opinion, there is some duty, or I keep saying righteousness on this episode, but there's something righteous about representing the downtrodden and the hopeless. And I think everybody's entitled to representation of some sort. And I, completely agree with our constitutional mandate that is the case.
Especially in criminal law.
Especially in criminal law.
The summary for me is that I think the client has the right to choose their attorney based on whatever kind of qualifications and criteria that they want. Firm has the right to represent, as long as it's legal, anyone that they deem righteous to be represented or that they want to represent. I do have an overarching kind of idea that everyone has a right to counsel, a right to representation, and that sometimes you may be representing someone that seems unsavory, or a case representing someone in a case that feels where the actions of the person you're representing are unsavory, and that's still the right thing to do. To the original point, I think a corporation has the right to move or not move, right?
I completely agree. I also think that it's look, you have to recognize that the American judicial system is an adversarial system, and it only works whenever people are represented.
Yeah.
You don't have one single neutral arbiter who is trying their best to collect all evidence and come up with a, fair resolution.
Yeah.
You have to have two parties who are presenting their best case to get at justice most of the time, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea is that the system bakes in the fairness.
Yeah, and so if one side is, downtrodden and hopeless without counsel, and the entire weight of, the system is bearing down on them, the system doesn't really work. You almost have to have a different system to justify it. That said, you don't have to be the person representing that individual or that corporation. And so I don't know, it's a really messy topic. And I think that you concluded it nicely by saying, of course, clients have the right to choose what firm they want to align themselves with, and firms have the right to choose what clients that they want to align themselves with. And there are going to be consequences from those decisions. So
that kind of speaks to the client's perspective. I think there's another perspective here, which is the partnership. And I think it is totally reasonable for Lewis to try and gain followers behind his cause, which is, it's just not worth the headache. And I think it's also reasonable for Jessica and Harvey to say the fight is worth the fight. We're going to take it regardless. Yeah, I completely agree. But there's tension there. And so it does, and it is a partnership. It is not a dictatorship. And there is going to be messy negotiation on whether or not to take the claim. Yeah. That makes sense to me. Yeah. Did you see the conversation between Lewis and Donna
Lewis is always trying to get Donna
I know.
to work for him.
I know. They made it almost seem romantic.
I know. Exactly. I love the like cat and mouse there.
I know.
And he's like, look, don't get me wrong. I'll throw her out the window in a heartbeat. Like, but I just can't do this.
But I just can't.
Yeah.
And then she whips the tickets out of her bra, which was like clear. Like, yeah, the sexual tension implication was so high there. Even though
I love the fact that it isn't sexual at all.
that's the thing. That's so funny. Yeah. They're like borrowing the sexual tropes to utilize in a situation that I don't think there's any sexual tension between either of them. Like,
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought that they nailed that.
Final thing, did you see when Donna goes into his office, to Lewis's office, behind Lewis there are a series of pictures? Did you see what were in the pictures?
No, I didn't notice that.
They were solo shots of Lewis. He has
No way.
He has
That's
3
perfect.
senior picture style photos of himself behind him.
Oh my God, that's the most Lewis thing ever. Honestly, I might try and do that. That's hilarious.
It's so good. It's so good.
He looks
and they were like,
so egotistical and just like...
oh, they had different
perfect.
backgrounds. So they're different poses, different backgrounds, different color suits. He was
so into yourself, and I'm sure poorly executed at that.
poorly executed.
Okay, let's dive into the meat of our conversation here, the criminal trial and all of its implications. So we started touching on it in our conversation about them even taking the case or not over at Pearson Hardman. Let's talk about this new evidence.
Okay.
So in the last episode, go check it out if you have any questions about this, but we briefly touched on the Brady rule, which is, in a sentence or two, that the prosecution has this duty to turn over exculpatory evidence to the defense.
Yeah.
We have a few other evidentiary issues, at least one that flows directly from the Brady rule. So there was this buried evidence that the prosecution didn't turn over. It's this camisole with DNA on it.
Yep.
Let's talk about the admissibility of evidence. Before evidence comes in a trial, you need a lay foundation. Can you tell us, what that is, why we have to lay a foundation?
Yeah, so the concept is basically proving to the judge that the evidence you're about to present is relevant and trustworthy enough to be presented to the jury. The judge is, the governor of of what evidence the jury gets to decide, and this is one of the first steps in being able to present evidence to the jury.
Yeah, exactly. And so the lawyers are trying to tell a story.
Yep.
Both sides have their own narrative of events here. What happened? The judge's job is to make sure that they're playing by the rules, and the story that they're telling is grounded in evidence that is, again, fair, trustworthy, and relevant. To that end, we have to make sure that we have a chain of custody before physical evidence is introduced.
Yeah, I mean, maybe to step in and say, and you can confirm this, the idea is you want to make sure that the evidence, when it was brought in, there's no way that it's been tampered with.
Exactly. So we want to make sure that this isn't some random camisole where you collected DNA from this person.
Yeah.
You had a camisole that happened to be similar to, the victims, and you introduced their DNA onto that camisole.
Yeah.
You want to make sure there wasn't tampering with the evidence.
Well, I think there's a malicious version and a less nefarious one.
Absolutely.
Right. The malicious one is you don't want someone to tamper with it. The less nefarious one is the cops that are accumulating this evidence. I mean, I gotta imagine they have crimes across the city, across the town, whatever size jurisdiction we're talking about, and they have mounds of evidence which could easily be mixed up if not for the requirement that there's a very strict process to make sure that the camisole I'm pulling from the shelf is the exact one that was found on the scene.
Absolutely. And especially in a place like New York where you could literally have another camisole in an evidence room somewhere. And so it's like you could truly, you pull the wrong camisole down to, a mistake that specific.
Yeah.
And so, that's exactly right. We want to make sure that it wasn't intentionally tampered with. Yeah. We also want to make sure that there wasn't error.
Yep.
So again, to that end, that's why a chain of custody is important. And it's part of laying foundation before evidence is introduced.
Makes sense.
So this is typically broached from the perspective of the prosecution trying to introduce evidence.
Yeah, because in most cases, the prosecution is trying to prove a case and the defense is trying to obfuscate against the case, right?
Yeah, that's right. And so the prosecution or the police working with the prosecution went out and did an investigation. They collected all of this evidence. They want to put on their case. They need to make sure that there was this appropriate chain of custody and they're not introducing, evidence that's, again, not trustworthy or not relevant to this specific case.
Yeah. And in this case, it's slightly different, right? Because Harvey's trying to introduce otherwise buried evidence that was in the police custody versus him being the prosecutor trying to introduce.
Yeah, exactly. And so a bit of a weird situation here where you would think that, we have to assume that the police aren't intentionally tampering with evidence to begin with. Otherwise, the system largely doesn't work. But it is a weird situation where the people who gathered the evidence are also responsible for the chain of custody. If there wasn't a proper chain of custody, the person who's being hurt is the defendant here, but due to no fault of their own.
Yeah, it feels very twisted.
It feels twisted. And there might be ways where you could introduce the evidence, or if not the evidence, you might be able to introduce evidence about how the evidence was even gathered. You could bring on one of the investigating officers, ask them questions about why wasn't there a proper chain of custody? Yeah. And so thereby
which they do in this case.
Yeah. And so you start to impeach the officers, you start to cast doubt, rightfully so, on the officer's conduct. But I've just got to say, the ultimate conclusion here is very plausible that you wouldn't be able to introduce the camisole. And I think that they pretty much got it right here. Yeah. And so I think that the judge probably made the right call here. I would love to hear from other attorneys on this one, specifically people who practice a lot of criminal defense work. But yeah, it might be a ruling that you're very frustrated by.
Yeah, it feels unfair.
It feels unfair, but judges are typically given broad discretion on these types of decisions, and I doubt it's reversible error. I don't know if it's an error at all, to be honest. It's an unfortunate ruling for the defense, but yeah. I think it's probably how it would shake out.
Yeah, I mean, it seems unfair, but we also are just told to believe that the camisole is the right camisole. Or that camisole was found on the scene, or that the DNA evidence hadn't been tampered with, which is kind of, it could be believed that it was messed with because it was buried before. I mean, there's, you're taking the assumption that the evidence is good and it's just not being admitted for technical reasons, but the technical reasons for it not being admitted may very well be relevant here. It may not be good evidence.
Yeah, absolutely. And while the bar is pretty low for relevance, if they have good reason to believe it's not trustworthy, it's probably going to be excluded. And at the risk of being redundant here, I just want to really emphasize the fact that even if the evidence doesn't come in, you could still put the officer on the stand, ask them questions about why they didn't take certain procedures. It's not like now that conversation is completely off limits.
Yeah. Agreed. We've been talking about this case all in the context of reopening the case, but one of the relevant pieces here is that the original prosecutor, Harvey, and his boss are no longer at the DA's office. So we're dealing with a wholly new entity who's kind of representing the state in this reopening of the case.
I was curious to see what his attitude was going to be, his demeanor in this new role.
Yeah, I guess maybe to take a step back, what did you think? He has a very tough line here. What did you think of his kind of approach? Did it feel tough but fair, or did it feel kind of a little bit taking, the full force of the state and pushing and pressuring against Clifford on it?
Good question. I think it's tough to give an answer to this one, but I think ultimately we're seeing this whole version of events from basically Harvey's perspective, Harvey, Mike, Pearson Hardman's perspective.
Agreed.
Setting that, or rather appreciating that, and taking a moment to instead view it from the new DA's perspective, it's like there's this convicted murderer who is, it came to light that there's maybe some new evidence.
After some bad actions on the DA's office.
Yeah, absolutely. After some bad actions on the DA's office. So trying to right some of the wrongs of his predecessors would probably be one of his mandates. But another mandate is probably not to be soft on crime.
Agreed.
And not to let out a bunch of convicted felons. He didn't put these people in jail. 12 jurors decided this person was guilty.
Yep.
And we have new evidence. And so in a lot of ways, it's like, I can't help but think the right outcome is a new trial. It's not just, okay, let's let everybody out.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I agree. Very fair. I think he should be understanding of a new trial.
Absolutely agree. And he should also be working hard to find all of this evidence. Yes. That is his responsibility.
Yeah.
He shouldn't just decide, well, let's see what the defense can dig up. It's like he has a responsibility to work hard to find evidence that was not previously presented.
Yeah, to prosecute criminals, not to prosecute people who could be criminals.
He's in all that to say he's in a really tough position here. I think that a new trial, trying to make sure that they find evidence that's been buried is his job. All that to say that's his job, which brings me to another question. What did you think about him working so hard to exclude this evidence?
Again, we're constantly vacillating between the forest and the trees on this one.
Yeah.
And I think the forest is he should be trying to put in jail people who are real criminals and finding the real criminals in this case.
Yeah.
And I think on that vertical, some of his tactics fail. I think he also, on the trees side of things, if he's in the middle of a fight, it is his obligation, if he thinks that the evidence muddies the water but doesn't get closer to truth, to try and exclude the evidence.
I agree. And so
he's trying to tell a story.
And he's got this quote that goes something like, Harvey, my job's to prosecute cases, your job's to defend them. That's how this works.
Yeah.
And which is kind of spot on.
I agree.
And so
it doesn't feel like he's nefarious, but I do think, again, back to the forest question, it's not really fair because we're being told a story where he doesn't have full information. Harvey basically knows that the friends are the guilty parties here. I'd be curious to hear how much Terrence knows of that story.
I would be too, but as soon as, he has pretty damning evidence that there was somebody else that did this, he immediately, dismisses the case.
Yeah.
Which is what I would do. I mean, I think that there is something, it's not binary. I don't want to say it's binary, but there is something, in my opinion, about breaking this down into two phases. You decide whether or not the case is worth prosecuting. And once it meets that threshold, you try and vigorously prosecute the case. You don't try and exclude relevant evidence. You certainly would never bury evidence.
Yeah.
But there is something about, again, this is an adversarial system. That's the way American justice works. Yeah. And you shouldn't take that decision to prosecute a case lightly. But to some extent, once you decide to prosecute the case, your job is to prosecute the case.
Okay, so this brings me to maybe a harder moral question, which is when they do open the case, or actually in an attempt to dissuade Harvey from reopening the case, he threatens to seek the maximum sentence for Clifford if they retry the case. What are your thoughts on that point?
It felt really vindictive, and there's no way I would do that.
I agree with you. That's the part where I think maybe he lost me on the tactics.
Yeah. As boring as it is, I completely agree with you there.
Because I think you're in a situation where the facts haven't changed in regard to Clifford's, how bad we think the crime was if Clifford actually committed it.
Completely agree.
So the sentencing for Clifford feels like it doesn't feel reopened, in my opinion. We don't have new evidence to say that his actions were worse. We don't have new evidence to say we're more certain. Well, frankly, it shouldn't be more certain because that's not speaking to sentencing. But let's be honest, it probably does.
To some extent,
probably does. So we're neither more certain that he committed the crime, nor are we more certain that the crime was more egregious than we originally thought. So why are we changing the sentencing for Terrence?
We're less certain that he committed the crime.
Yeah.
We're less certain. And we also know that there was prosecutorial misconduct.
Yes.
And we've already talked about the importance of procedural justice. So it's like, if anything, there should be a more lenient outcome.
And I would add a third thing. It seems by all accounts that he's an upstanding citizen in jail and he's trying to turn his life around.
Yeah. We've talked about this before, but you have to have the stakes. Completely get that. This show does such an exceptional job, in my opinion, making the stakes pretty believable.
Yeah.
And I could even see a prosecutor choosing to take that tack.
I was going to say, I could see that being attacked because they don't want, and here, me putting my best spin on it from a prosecutor's perspective. There's been prosecutorial misconduct in the past. I don't think that this case is one of those cases. And now you're forcing us, we think you, defendant, are being opportunistic, and you're forcing the state to use its limited resources to continue to prove that this case was righteously decided. That's the best spin I can get for Terrence.
I think that while generous, that's a fair spin, and I couldn't give a better spin than that. Yeah. And so, look, this whole conversation, if we go back and accidentally edit out a couple of sentences where we stumbled here or there, like, could be taken out of context in such tremendous fashion. Sure. But ultimately, it's the prosecutor's job to seek justice. They have all of these resources at their disposal. It's not their job to let everybody off. It's certainly not their job to prosecute everybody where they think that they could get a conviction. It's to try and seek justice, and threatening to throw the book at somebody in this situation who has already been wronged by the system just does not feel like justice.
Yeah, it feels wrong to me.
That kind of implicates this either exclusionary rule or the fruit of the poisonous tree doctrine.
Yep.
All that means is that evidence that is illegally obtained isn't going to be admissible at a criminal trial. And also evidence that flows from that poisonous tree, the fruit, so evidence that comes later on that you get as a result of that illegally obtained evidence is also not going to be admissible.
Yeah, which kind of makes sense, right? Like we have a high standard for what evidence can be admissible for the attorneys to tell their stories.
Yeah, and it's also, these are protections that are enshrined in our Constitution, and we want to make sure that you can't commit some illegal act, and sure, that's not admissible, but then you can, as an officer, you might be incentivized to commit that act anyways because you're able to get all of this indirect or derivative benefit from it.
Yep.
I mean, so we mentioned these constitutional protections. Can you tell us where this doctrine is derived from?
Yeah, high level, the doctrine is kind of derivative of the Fourth Amendment, which says there's a bar against illegal search and seizures by the government. And so, any evidence that is derived from those illegal search or seizures should be barred, as the court, Supreme Court has decided, because it's the fruit from the poison tree that is the illegal search and seizure.
Yeah, exactly.
And this is applied not just to the federal government, but to all states as well through the 14th Amendment. Yeah, so the 14th Amendment was ratified after the Civil War, and it effectively protects all persons from state laws that attempt to deprive them of life, liberty, and property. And so the Supreme Court has taken the Bill of Rights and applied it to the states via the 14th Amendment.
Is it fair to say that's why the Fourth Amendment that protects against illegal searches and seizures would apply to, a state prosecutor?
Exactly. Yeah. So it would apply to a state prosecutor or the state police force.
We have more context now. We have, we've talked about what evidence would come in, why some evidence didn't come in, knew some of these factors before taking the case. Some came to light in trial based on the judge's rulings. All of that said, would you take the risk that Harvey took here? Not with his own life, but with Clifford's life?
Yeah, that one's tough. I think the reality is, if I were to take a step back and think about Clifford's life, there are kind of two realities. One is three realities. One is he stays in jail. He serves his next 4 years, and he comes out a convicted felon who everyone in the world thinks murdered some young woman. So he's unemployable. Socially, he's a total pariah. But in 4 years, he gets to be free man. The second version is, he wins the case and he gets out. He's vindicated. Sure, he's carrying around the arbitrage as that is this criminal case, but ideally he gets to say, oh no, he becomes a sympathetic victim of the system here, and he gets to live his life freely and maybe can go to college, maybe can better himself and have a more full life.
And do you think that there's any way that he could get that sympathy without going to trial and without, being found not guilty in a subsequent trial?
I think the answer is no.
Yeah.
I think he's going to be carrying, because for one, every new employer is not going to have the context. They're busy. They're not going to have.
I think that's right.
They're not going to read in all of the information needed to basically say, "Oh, this guy was screwed."
Yeah, you'd have to have a damn good PR team to build the story for you and pump it out to the world.
Yeah, that would take tons of money, which he doesn't have now because he's taken out some of his prime economic years. We have the two alternatives, and we have a third alternative, which is introduced by Terrence, which is not only is he potentially going to stay in jail, he may get a longer sentence than he was already given. And so those are our three realities that we're kind of dealing with here. I actually think you have to blame Harvey here, and I think you have to be upset with Harvey for not doing the due diligence, that his case was so tight that option 3, where Clifford gets a longer sentence, is off the table. And I think he needs to have done the negotiations with the prosecutor to understand that they're aligned around trying to find truth. He needs to make sure that the evidence that he plans to tell his story is locked down. It can't be something where he'll figure it out at the end. This is a guy's life that you already put in jeopardy and frankly took part of his life away from him. In a lot of these cases where there's prosecutorial misconduct or misconduct of the state, there's a remuneration that the defendant, the party receives. So which
I think he's absolutely entitled to. Yeah.
So
unequivocally.
I guess the point being, I think I would not have taken Harvey's positions without doing an exceptional amount of due diligence, both on the realpolitik side and on the evidentiary kind of story building side of things.
Yeah, it did feel like, he was piecing this all together in the 11th hour whenever this guy's life's at stake.
Yeah, I think you can do that when you're strapped for time or when you're, dealing with stakes that are lower because people don't want to, spend the money on it. This case, to reopen it and to not know what the outcome is going to be or have very strong odds. I mean, I think for 80% of this episode, in my mind, I did not see an outcome where he wins the case, and great storytelling.
Exactly.
Gets me excited.
Yeah, kept you on edge. Yeah. Whenever we find out how he does, have a nice resolution, we're excited.
But terrible as an attorney.
How about from Clifford's perspective? Would you put yourself in his shoes? What are you doing here?
I will humbly admit that I have no ability to understand what the loss of liberty looks like or feels like. As a hubristic guy who is not in jail, I would argue I would take every risk I could to get out of jail.
If it's just about getting out of jail, I'm serving the 4 more years.
Oh, you wouldn't take the odds.
I would.
But when would you make that decision? Because I would say if there's buried evidence with prosecutorial misconduct before you talk to the prosecutor, that seems like a very winnable case, like a workable case.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
If I felt like there's a decent chance I'm going to lose the case and I have certainty around 4 more years or maybe the rest of my life, I'm not taking that bet. You know why I might take the bet?
Yeah.
To clear my name.
Yeah, because after 4 years, you don't have your life back.
Yeah. And so I would probably take that bet just to clear my name.
Yeah. So
with the caveat that Jared threw out.
Your decision has changed when Terrence introduced the idea that he's going to step on your neck effectively.
I don't think it would change my decision. I think I would take the new trial, but it's just to clear my name at that point. Once he throws out that bit of information, if it's just about, 4 more years for sure, maybe 0, maybe the rest of my life, even if I thought I had a pretty strong case, I'd be like, shit, I think I've already got used to this. I think I'm doing my 4 years, but I would take just about every risk imaginable to try and clear my name.
So I guess that brings us to, there's a point where we're in dire straits. We think Harvey's lost this case. This innocent kid's going to go to jail for longer than he was already sentenced. And in a classic Harvey move, he pulls out some insane ploy to convince one of the two parties to go against the other party, right? It's a Mississippi burning plot twist that he implies that he implores in his real life.
Yeah.
How do you think they resolve that point? Do you think that you could convince co-conspirators that that one of them is going to give up the other?
100%. Happens all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure a lot of people have heard about the prisoner's dilemma. It got its name because, it actually happens in practice all the time. And the idea is, you've got two parties. You are making your decisions independently of the other person. You don't know what your co-conspirator is going to do. If you both turn on each other, you have some medium outcome.
Yes.
If the other person turns on you and you don't turn on them, you have the worst outcome.
Yep.
And so the question becomes, do you turn on the other person or not? And it's a game of trust. If you both fully and completely trust each other, nobody turns on anybody, you have the best outcome. But you have no idea what the other person what decision they've made. You have to make your own decision in isolation. You see this game play out. Forget the details. You see the game play out in real life, and people turn on each other all the time.
Well, but that's actually, I think that after you play out the game, the game results in a perverse outcome where more often than not, both parties will turn on each other at the same time, because the fear of having the worst outcome perpetrated upon them is so great that they can't control the other outcome. The only thing they can control is their own actions, such that they both will turn. And so you're in a very inefficient situation.
Well, but then, so let's set aside game theory here. In this context, he has a pretty good sense of where this is going for him.
Yeah.
They've pretty much laid out the story of where this is going for him. He's going to probably be convicted, spend a bunch of time in jail, or he can give up, his co-conspirator. And long story short, I think that that's absolutely plausible.
I think it's possible. I think it's a good plot twist, and I think it's plausible, and it's based on human nature. Throughout this whole case, we have the drama that is Harvey and Donna's relationship. Donna effectively saved Harvey last episode from being dragged in the mud by his prior boss. And Harvey's pissed.
Yeah.
Do you think it's righteous?
No, I don't. But I think Harvey makes a good point where he says this entire relationship is built on trust, and he feels like the trust has been broken a little bit.
Yep.
I don't think that Donna really had an alternative, or maybe she did, but regardless, I think her actions were justified. I guess there is a world in which she tells Harvey what she's doing.
Yeah.
I'm turning over this evidence, and then you could be furious that you don't agree with the actions, but there's something, I guess, you feel slightly less betrayed. You feel stabbed in the front, not stabbed in the back.
Yeah, it's funny though, because I think Donna realizes that Harvey's unable to make an unemotional decision, and then she goes to Jessica. She
tried to go to Harvey first too.
She tries to go to Harvey first, and I think on top of that, she goes to Jessica. I think that's the right call if I'm Donna. Like I can't think of a better step for her. She's not then turning it over to the prosecutor. She knows that she doesn't know how this game is played.
Yeah.
Although she's pretty freaking savvy.
There's no doubt about that. So let me jump in real quick. If you're Harvey in this situation, best you can, how would you feel about it? Do you think, I mean, I guess we can't get inside of his mind, but do you think you're immediately grateful?
So here's what I would say.
Or do you feel a little bit betrayed at first?
I would probably feel like it was my decision to make, but I guarantee you Harvey is grateful that this happened as everything played out. As a Monday morning quarterback, he is 100% grateful that Donna did what she did, because otherwise he would have been burned.
There's no doubt about it.
So
she saved the day.
Yeah. But I can understand where your expectation is this person is helping you out in your business and you've asked them to not do something and they did it anyway.
Yeah. It was cool to see them reconcile though with their pretrial ritual.
What do you think the can openers for?
No clue. I don't think I want that as part of my pretrial ritual.
I do like that they kind of introduced
I'm nervous,
multiple. Yeah. Wow. For some reason, I'm thinking tuna fish.
Like, disgusting.
Oh, gross.
Yeah.
I love that they just dropped that on you, because my mind just goes like
totally
wild over it. Do you have
well
any,
done, writers. Well done.
Yeah. Do you have any pretrial?
I'm gonna get one after watching this.
Good. That's smart. I think that's smart.
One other thing that I wanted to ask you about, we kind of pivoted away from it, but I want to go back to you're Harvey. You're trying to convince any client, forget about Clifford for a minute, that you're well suited for their case. There's this tension between confidence and overpromising.
Yeah.
How do you think about that? Because I'll set the stage real quick and say, oftentimes it's actually an ethical breach to promise or guarantee some outcome.
Yep.
Because as it should be, because you don't have total control over the circumstances.
Yeah. I mean, I think ultimately it's hard because you're trying to win business and people want certainty in an uncertain world. And, you know, we're all dealing in odds, but everyone thinks in binary perspective. Yeah. And so they want you to create the certainty for them. I just don't think you can. I think ultimately you have to say, I'm your best odds of winning. And anyone who gives you certainty is lying to you. And I want to represent you because I'm your best odds. I think that's the best pitch you can give someone. I
think that's right. And then, you project the confidence, you just don't make the guarantee.
I actually think it's more confident by not making the guarantee. For me as an individual, if someone gives me a guarantee of something
that I know they don't have control over, I lose so much trust.
So much confidence in them.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Harvey, in typical Harvey fashion, is able to pull a rabbit out of his hat, and our buddy Clifford gets to walk free, and Harvey's conscience is cleared. We're given a total cliffhanger when Mike's friend Trevor walks in to talk to Jessica. What the hell do you think he's about to say?
Mike is a fraud.
That was my thought at first. I just don't know how that can be the answer when we know that this series goes on.
We have how many more seasons left?
Yeah. Or do we think Jessica gets introduced to this? Is she implicated in this fraud now?
That's exactly what I think happens.
I don't think so.
I think she's implicated in the fraud. Harvey does some Harveying and convinces her that...
Well, then does Mike go back to school? Because I don't think, if I'm Jessica, there's no way that I can leave it as is.
And then you're like, I don't know how this is going to unfold. I'm curious.
Even worse, Mike's already in the database at Harvard. So there's no going back to school. There's no rectifying it. Like, to me, if I'm Jessica, there's no way that I can perpetrate this fraud, which leads me to the result that is, I think Trevor he tells some terrible information, but he doesn't blow him up completely. And I think he then figures out a way to continue to lord it over Mike.
Oh, you think Trevor's going to hold it over his head?
I think that's what he does. To be honest, it's actually more fruitful for Trevor, harder to do emotionally, but more fruitful to Trevor if he just continues to hold it over his head.
I just don't think that he's thinking about this in a rational way, or he's trying to manipulate, him going forward. I think he's just trying to blow up his life.
He's just so pissed. He just wants to detonate. This is a mutually assured destruction.
Yeah, I think that's pretty much right. And I think that pretty much wraps up this conversation. And that's all for season 1.
That's all for season 1. I can't believe we got all the way through season 1.
Yeah. And thanks for being along for the ride. If you've made it this far, please like and subscribe. And as usual, let us know what you want to see more of. Drop some comments.
Yeah, please let us know before we kick off season 2.
Otherwise, we'll see you there. We'll see you at season 2.